Hey, welcome back to another episode of Chaotic Underground. My name is Ryan Damask. I'm here with my good friends Zach Z Diggity, Mr. Steve Aroni Steven. How are you guys today?
Doing good, buddy. Getting ready to talk about more interesting topics along the way of unknown kind of stuff that we usually do. In the subject today is actually one of my favorites, a personal favorite in terms of just weird, wacky things that happen in the world. The subject of Kowloon Walled City.
Bom,
So
bom, bom.
yeah, sound effects here. But actually, Kowloon City is something that has existed within our lifetime and sounds like a setting for Shadowrun or Cyberpunk. And you a lot of things that you've seen with that theme have used Kowloon Walled City as a basis for the imagery of it. And to go ahead and get started, well, I guess actually the best thing to do would be, have you guys ever heard of Kowloon Walled City before I basically pitched this idea and was like, all right, let's get researching?
I haven't, not until you brought it up about, this was before we even started Chaotic Underground. Me and you were just pitching back and forth some ideas to some crazy topics to talk about. And you brought this up and I immediately was like entranced. I was like, this is one of the coolest things I've ever heard of. And like you said, this is like not distant history or anything. Like this was very recent in our lifetime.
Yeah, so I didn't hear about it until you presented it, and then I started my research on it, and my whole I just got flooded, which I will get into later in the episode. I got flooded with a bunch of like, oh, that's where they got that from. Oh, that's where they got them from multiple sources of like movies, video games, books. Like instantly, I was like, I had no idea that this place. Like that, I didn't realize that it existed. Because basically, I feel like media has been using that as like you said, as reference.
Yeah, it's been a part of media for the better part of probably close to like 4 or 5 decades at this point. And we'll get into some of the fun pop culture association as we get further in. But without further ado, I'm going to kind of start off with a little bit of history. And if you guys want to interject with some stuff maybe you found along the way or something I've missed, by all means,
don't worry.
I'm sure you will. I mean, we do this every time. But to get things started, we have to go back in time to the first Opium War, primarily when the British and the Chinese were fighting the hell out of each other, and the Chinese were not doing so well. Basically, the Qing dynasty lost the war, and this is how the British got Hong Kong originally, and it was a smaller area originally whenever it first happened. So
they got the bottom half or something, right?
Yeah, it wasn't until further wars that came along, like the Second Opium War and some more handy defeats on the part of the British to the Chinese, that they got the full extent of Hong Kong. And in the Hong Kong area, there is Kowloon Fort, basically an old military fort out there that really just wasn't in use anymore too much. And the British, were taking over everything at the time, and they didn't really do too much with it.
So the way I understood it was basically the British captured that bottom half or whatever of Hong Kong, and then so to keep an eye on their activities, the Chinese set up this fort, the Kowloon Fort, right on the border. But then after that Second Opium War, whenever the British got the rest of Hong Kong, this fort is like no longer accessible by the Chinese because now it's in the middle of Hong Kong. And so, but it was still technically belonged to the Chinese. So the Chinese shipped all their people out of there and the British didn't take it. So it just kind of became its own little DMZ.
Yeah, so this is what's interesting is it's actually they had during one of the treaties that they had brokered between the Chinese and the British, they basically had said as long as the Chinese officials were there, that Kowloon was under the Kowloon Fort was under the jurisdiction of those Chinese officials as long as they were there. And it's this kind of like throwaway line that kind of puts no responsibility on one or the other. And as time progresses, eventually the British are like, oh yeah, the Chinese are there, that's under their jurisdiction. And they were like, fuck you, we're going to come in and kick you all out anyways. And that's exactly what they did. They marched in there with
After like many failed attempts, though, like they tried to do this for years, and they were like fought back with like riots and
you're
people just
talking
refusing to leave.
You're talking about when they've actually built the city. That hasn't happened yet. Originally,
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
This is way back in late 1800s and first part of the 1900s, and basically that law had been established in the treaty, and the British ignored it and just went in and kicked all the Chinese officials out and kind of took it over.
They were basically just like crossing their fingers, like, oh yeah, sure, that's a thing, and then they're like, fuck that, and they just went in. And,
absolutely, they were going to British Empire all over this shit. But this is also at the peak of their strength. I mean, we're talking about a country that has taken over the majority of the world at one point in history. Right. I mean, they had India, they had I think it was South Africa and other areas, but this was just one of those areas. Now the problem is what happens next in history is what kind of makes it harder on the British to actually maintain any kind of control over it, and that is World War I and World War II, specifically World War II. They lose a lot of people, resources, things like that. They almost got defeated in World War II. So it's kind of hard to watch out on Kowloon Fort when it's 10,000 miles away, and you don't have the people, resources to send people over there. There's a small detachment over there, and in 1933, the peasants in China decide to move into the fort. And at that time, the British are like, hey, whoa, no, get the hell out. And they comply. And it's like that. But after World War II, they basically 2,000 people had moved into the area of this fort. 2,000 Chinese people. And they tried to march back in and say, get the hell out. And they had rocks thrown at them, bricks thrown at them. And they were just completely chased out of the fort. And the British were like, well, I guess that's how it goes. And that is the start of it.
Like being able to retake or occupy Kowloon, it seemed like it was more of a hassle than it was actually worth to the British. So that's kind of why they turned a blind eye after they tried to get the squatters out. It feels like, and they were like, and then it just snowballed. I mean, I guess Kowloon is a perfect example of what happens when you let a bunch of squatters fully develop a city.
Absolutely.
So. And it's important to note, like the size of this place. We're not talking like a monster area of land. We're talking about like a city block. It's like 126 meters by 213 meters. It was essentially just a small city block. It would take you no time to walk around the entire walled city.
Exactly.
7 acres.
Yeah. To give you, I think somebody put it as it's the size of 4 soccer fields. And if you can even just imagine the size of a soccer field, just put 4 of those together in like basically a square. And that's the actual area that you have for the Kowloon Walled City. Now, it hasn't become Kowloon Walled City quite yet. But then, when the Communist Party takes over China and, between World War II wearing out the British and Civil War wearing out the Chinese, there's all these refugees, anarchists, dropouts, things like that start traveling to get away. And they come upon Kowloon, and China can't touch it because it's British, and they don't want to run the risk of starting a war, and neither does Britain. So it's kind of left in this little like limbo zone. So all these people travel across China, and it comes to the point where I think I have the note here. By 1950, there were 17,000 people living in what will become Kowloon Walled City. They start creating these makeshift living quarters and things like that, and it's densely populated, but it hasn't really hit the full limit yet. And what happens is a giant fire occurs in the core of the city, and it burns everything to the ground.
Yep.
And instead of leaving, everyone stays.
Yeah. And they all ended up there because... I'll go for it, Ryan.
No. Go.
Well, they all went there, and a lot of the residents ended up there because of they were evicted, they went bankrupt, they fell into hard times, and so they ended up living there. And I guess my question, I don't know if this encompassed any of your research because I didn't catch it. Like, you're a citizen in 1945, 50s China. You just get evicted. You have not a dime. Your option: be homeless on the streets of where you used to live, or there's this place, Kowloon, that you go. What do you think is the process of, like, I don't think Kowloon had landlords that you go up and knock on the
No.
door. Like, is it like it was in video games where like you end up in this city, you run into the quest giver guy, and he was just like, "Oh, come on, well, I'll introduce you to Mitch. He's got a job for you," and then you just start your life in Kowloon that way. I mean, like it just seems like a weird process to start, you know?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, you have full on entrepreneurs in this city that are, well, for a period of time, Stephen, I'm sure you're going to get into this, but it did have some form of its own law under the triad, that they kind of were over everything. So I have to imagine they were probably in control of taking rent and stuff like that. But I mean, you had some. It wasn't all just like, your poor everyday, bottom of the barrel people or anything like that. By no means. You had doctors there that, escaped their home country and couldn't get a license to work in like Hong Kong, for instance. So they would go and be a doctor or a dentist or whatever in Kowloon, where rent was astronomically cheap compared to places in Hong Kong and things like that.
Yeah.
And so you had just like a own bustling society from like lower class all the way to upper class.
Yeah.
I guess, and concerning those doctors, a lot of them were unlicensed, or part of my research, I found that a lot of people who were practicing dentistry didn't even go to school for it. They taught themselves dentistry,
Mm-hmm.
and
That one woman.
God,
There's a lot of articles on I can't think of her name. I don't have that article pulled up in front of me, but yeah, it's a pretty crazy story.
So,
but oh, sorry, Stephen. If you want to continue.
I wanted to address the question of like, is it like a quest giver? Is it like when games or movies present? And it's not exactly like that. That's the thing. A lot of times in media, it's kind of twisted to like have a certain message and a lot of negativity involved with it. But it's actually, during this period after the fire that I mentioned, when the whole city as it was burned to the ground, like everything, like you got 17,000 people that basically have to start over, and they start building small apartments. And so when the thing is, they can't go outside the fort, so they have to build upwards. And so what happens is you start having people building cinder block based apartments on top of each other, and they would actually, you would get there and basically everybody learned how to work together. Like, hey, I see you have a pretty stable apartment. I'm going to build on top of yours. And like everybody kind of came together to construct different elements of this wall. See, because that's the thing you need to really kind of put in your head is there wasn't an upward structure on this, right. This property. Everybody had to work together to make it work. So it was more of a community based, like almost a communal system. And so it probably is a little bit like the quest giver. Like you had to know somebody to talk to so you could get involved to get an apartment. As a matter of fact, during my research, there were cases of like real estate offices in Kowloon for like, so they would build apartments and then rent them to people through a real estate agency. Like it's such a Wild West idea.
I before we recorded tonight, like in the afternoon, I messaged you guys because I was about a good chunk through my research and everything, and I said like it seems like it would be really awful to live in Kowloon, but at the same time, really cool as well.
Yes.
And there's one quote that I saw that resonated with me that I said that I wanted to bring up. This is a quote from a resident. It's just a small sentence of what a lifestyle was like as a kid there. And he said, "We just play ping pong in the hallways. The kids would go up on the roofs and leap from building to building, or we would drag discarded mattresses to the roof and jump on them. It was a happy time."
Mm-hmm.
So I have no doubt that people carved out a nice little niche life for themselves. But like you go into the darker stuff of it, like there's incredible power issues because everything was built by the residents.
Mm-hmm.
You could run water only at certain times. The water, if it came out clean, that was an issue. Meat and food was prepared at a very, very, non-regulated fashion. And so I think there is something to said to be living, because as somebody who lived in like city life for most of my young adult life, there is something very endearing to that like quality of like bohemian living. But at the same time, this is an entirely different level that I couldn't even imagine.
Yes, and this is also a time of great turmoil involving communist China. So there's a lot of the people who were involved in this were people that weren't really jiving on communism or its very rigid rules. But then there was also criminals. I mean, like you said, there's plenty of stories of people's like experiences being good in Kowloon, but there's still plenty of stories of negativity as well. You had a rampant drug trade. Um, you had heroin dealers and opium dens, prostitution. It was not uncommon for people to actually overdose on heroin in their apartment and not be their body not be discovered for months. So yes, while Kowloon has this kind of like sort of like reverent nostalgic feeling when it's presented and talked about in some circles, there was still a lot of stuff that was bad and gross, and unfortunately that also tends to be a case in most scenarios where people are less fortunate or have less to work with. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of, like, it's an illegal practice now, but like reusing oil, like in China, it wasn't the fact that they were reusing oil, they were getting the oil from the sewers and basically
Jeez.
straining it and reusing it to cook.
Get the
Nice.
Really?
Yeah, and it was because the thing is when you're talking about a country that uses so much oil, especially with the population it has, it's kind of hard to keep a hearty supply, or the supply that does exist is very expensive. So this is a practice that is not unknown of in slums and lower income areas, and I'm sure a practice like that existed in Kowloon, which makes it even wilder that one of the things Kowloon came to be known for was its food.
Mm-hmm.
Believe it or not, residents of Hong Kong would often travel into Kowloon as like a great place to eat and get good, unique food. Popular noodle bars. I think one of the stats I saw along the way was that at one point it was calculated that 80% of the rice balls consumed in Hong Kong came from Kowloon Walled City.
Yeah, I saw that.
I was like,
That
what?
is so cool.
Yeah, it's
and then
crazy.
There was after the British kind of took control of Hong Kong, they outlawed or made a lot of food more taboo. And like for instance, dog meat was really popular. Was considered really really popular food for citizens in Hong Kong, and then the British kind of outlawed that. So people from Hong Kong would travel into Kowloon to eat their dog meat and other forms of food like that that you couldn't get anywhere else.
Absolutely.
There was a lot of travel into Kowloon for goods because they're cheaper, because there was a whole rubber factory there, and they don't have to follow any kind of fire code or safety codes or anything like that, or so they can make goods at a much cheaper rate, so they can sell them at a much cheaper rate. So they were just selling out to everywhere.
Yeah, and that's where you get into the actual like financial and kind of like the structure of Kowloon Walled City. So while everybody was kind of communal living and building on top of each other, at the same time, they were also turning every one of their rooms into a business. You could be selling snacks that you bought in bulk from Hong Kong. They developed factories. People made clothing, made food. There were just countless businesses that were run straight out of the building that kids learned school in. They slept in, like 3 different families lived in these apartments, and they were usually about like 30 square meters.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And to be clear, I'm saying cool because it is fascinating to me on this stuff, because if there's one thing I'm very just always impressed with is the adaptability of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
And it because I call me naive for saying this, I do believe in humanity. I do believe if we get our heads straight, we can accomplish amazing and great things. And I feel like while Kowloon is kind of like came to fruition through crime and drugs and quite frankly, desperation, I hear the story of them straining oil to get cooking. We will do anything to survive. So if like the world does blow up and there's about 15% of us in the world left, I think we're going to figure something out.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll be addressing further into the episode is actually there are numerous things like this. It's just that Kowloon is probably the most well-known and kind of revered and referenced but there are other situations like this which we'll cover. But yeah, so Kowloon at this point in history starts building upwards, and as a matter of fact, they have a limit. They are limited to 14 stories, because any higher would run the risk of interfering with airplanes from the Hong Kong airport, which is right next to it.
Literally, like right next door to it.
Yes, there was basically an account of kids playing soccer on top of Kowloon Walled City amongst the TV aerials while a giant airplane flies overhead, and they just ignore it. Like they've all become very used to this lifestyle. But I mean, there was a lot.
Do you think
what?
It's kind of dumb, but do you think, like, much like if you live by train tracks, you eventually don't hear the train? Do you think, like, they eventually just didn't hear the
Absolutely
747s
absolutely
going over their heads?
100%.
I think the general volume in this city was probably at a maximum all times, regardless of airplanes, just because of how dense it was.
Yes, I think one of the info pieces I got from something I was watching was the fact that if you blew up the density of Kowloon City to the size of Manhattan, it would be 1.2 million people per square kilometer. That's just taking the density numbers of like how many people were smacked into this place and trying to blow it up. It's a massive amount of people in this place.
Yeah,
And
to give some reference to that, Hong Kong, which is one of the most densely populated places already in the world, at that time was a population density of 6,700 people per square kilometer. Kowloon Walled City, 1.9 million people per square kilometer at its peak.
Jeez.
yeah, that's the thing is, like, multiple families would basically live in multi-generational families would live in these small 30 by 30 rooms, no bigger than say like the room I'm in right now. Like they said the comparison they used was an average American bedroom was about the size that you would see, and it's
or a New York studio apartment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which tend to be smaller these days anyway.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's one thing that I kind of wanted to touch on with it is the references of the media that it has translated into. And we could briefly talk about this because when I did my research, the very first thing that popped in my head, because I recently played it, Stray.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Stray popped in my head, which if you don't know Stray, it's a game about you're playing an adorable cat who gets separated from his litter, and you go through an adventure. And the architecture is built very similar to Kowloon. And then the next thing that popped in my head is Midgard from Final Fantasy VII, especially Wall City. Not Wall City. Is it called Wall Street?
Wall Market in Midgard.
Wall Market. Yeah, Wall Market. And then let's not forget, Bloodsport took place basically in Kowloon. If you ever seen the movie Bloodsport,
I have been resisting to bring up Bloodsport because that. Okay, did you guys end up down an insane rabbit hole involving Bloodsport at all?
Mm-mm.
I started to go down to it, but then I had other stuff.
I'm absolutely cutting in here with some weirdness because Kowloon Walled City is fantastic. Coming back to that, but Bloodsport is insane. Not only is it set in Kowloon Walled City in the story, if you dig deeper, this movie is about a guy named Frank. And in real life, there's a guy named Frank Dux who insisted that he, at age 16, a ninjutsu master shipped him to Matsuda, Japan, and trained him in the ways of ninjutsu. And the story of Bloodsport is his autobiographical account of the first kumite he went to. And it's a 60-person single elimination fighting competition. And he won 56 matches in a row and went on to win the whole thing. And
wow,
this is that story. This is that story.
We need to watch. We need to watch Bloodsport together. I haven't seen Bloodsport for so long.
And it's just so bonkers. And he said he was in the U.S. military and the CIA sent him on secret missions in Vietnam. I mean, the guy has said some wild stuff, and basically it was proven to all be 100% bullshit. Like that, no one can locate the ninjutsu master that he said by name with the nickname Tiger. He no one can actually account for a 60-person highly skilled single elimination fighting event because that would be noticed.
I think we can do an entire episode
I was
about
just
this
thinking
guy.
that.
Yeah, I won't go too much further, but it was a rabbit hole that I was like, oh, cool, Bloodsport. I remember that movie. Crazy. Like Kowloon Walled City is the setting, and then I read all the details. I was like, what am I reading? Who is this man? And there's all kinds of details. Like, okay, cool. I'm basically gunning for a full episode. But
All right, I'm gonna write his name down real quick. Yeah, Frank Dukes.
yeah, it's a wild story. But that's also Jean-Claude Van Damme's first major role. Another important distinction is actually one of Jackie Chan's most serious roles in popular movies was filmed in Kowloon City after it had been set to be destroyed. And they actually
Which movie?
it was the movie Crime Story. It was from 1993, which is
I don't remember that one.
yeah. It's basically is about this this police detective who is assigned to a case where a businessman was kidnapped, and what happens is he's got his own issues going on too, because he basically had to shoot people, and that's always really rough. So he's basically this guy in the police force who's already traumatized and going through stuff, has to hunt down a kidnapped businessman while people on the inside and the outside are facing off against him. This is also, early Jackie Chan, and a lot of people are used to his like kind of goofy nature, and it's like one of the first like serious roles he had. But they actually end up blowing up parts of Kowloon Walled City for scenes at the end of the movie, and we should definitely watch it.
Like legit?
Yeah, it's in the city.
So they legit blow it up because it was set to be demolished.
As a matter of fact, yes, it did. Because the truth is a little spoiler for the end is, yes, Kowloon City was inevitably vacated and destroyed. But this is China and Hong Kong we're talking about. So most of the demolition was done by tool. They couldn't afford or weren't willing to use dynamite and things like that. So when a movie studio goes, hey, we'll blow up some of that thing you're trying to take down, they don't exactly say no. They're like, all right, go for it, Jackie Chan. You're a national treasure.
That's awesome.
But yeah, where we were in terms of Kowloon Walled City was kind of like the peak. We're talking about like the 80s and late 70s and stuff like that. And you mentioned the triads, and believe it or not, the triads, while drug dealers and pimps and all kinds of illegal masterminds, they also served as a de facto city hall and service provider. They
they had like a volunteer fire department and all kinds of cool stuff.
They had schools in there. They had libraries. They had 2 temples in Kowloon Walled City. But they also had something really interesting I never thought I'd hear whenever I was researching this, was they had mailmen, like an organized mail system.
One mailman.
For the whole city.
One mailman for the whole city.
Yes, and he had to memorize the route.
I hate to be that guy.
He had to memorize the route.
What route is there in this place?
There isn't.
What route is there to follow? There's no rhyme or reason in this city.
This is probably the man I am most impressed with out of this entire page of the history book, right? Like this one man visiting, which at its peak, I don't know if we put that number up there yet, but at its peak, it was anywhere from like 45 to 55,000 people that lived here in like the 80s. And you had one mailman that made that route to all those people
without a map.
Absolutely bonkers to me.
There wasn't a written map of the route until I think 1986 or something like that. Like and it was still very rudimentary. Like you still had to kind of have knowledge of the city to accomplish even with that map. So it's wild that was even an option. It's insane the kinds of things these people came together and did. And I think that's probably one of the most fascinating and nostalgic things about it is these people fashioned a life, a culture, businesses to really come together and build a freaking city on top of an old fort out of cinder blocks and chain link fence and bits and pieces you find here and there to run power. Like that's the thing you have to realize. So there were people there with capabilities to be architects, electricians, plumbers, things. They learned this stuff and made it happen on their own. And that's an impressive human feat. And, what was it? You showed us that graphic that shows a little bit of what the city looks like, but one of the
we'll put it up on the screen.
Yeah. One of the more interesting facts, if you look on the left side, is that it was a 35, I guess it's Hong Kong dollars.
Hong Kong dollars.
Yeah. 35 Hong Kong dollars a month to rent one of these apartments there. and run your business out of it and all kinds of things. And this was all managed. Like there were different landlords for different, areas, because there was like 5,000 buildings in the end. Like they're stacked on top of each other. Like when you look at the picture, it's not like it's a perfect little like cube system. There are some that are like kind of like off kilter, and there's little sections and spaces that nothing is in because this was kind of figured out as they went. And it's really interesting what people managed to accomplish. I mean, you can still look at color pictures from the 80s of like the streets below and like where one of the entrances is, and see people's balconies with their laundry drying out on the balcony, and all the different like kind of like AC units they managed to attach to this place.
Yeah, and there's like the corridors used to get around. Like some of them are so tight, like you could barely fit through them. But this was like regular pathways that people use every day.
Yeah, they were like 3 feet wide. That as you travel through this kind of made up building, this made up skyscraper, if you will, because 14 stories to me isn't exactly like a short building.
Yeah, the whole thing is ingenious, and the fact that it was just cobbled together like a little bit at a time, like there was no planning. There was something like 70 or more wells in the city, and they had electric pumps that brought them up to tanks on the top of the city, and then water was distributed out from those tanks to all the different homes. The electric wires running all, like if you look at any pictures, you just see tons of electric wires and pipes just like surrounding these buildings because they wanted to try to prevent fire. So they ran all electricity outside the buildings.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. In history, this place did have a fire at one point in history, right? Yeah. I think you actually mentioned earlier in the episode. Yeah. I imagine if there's any kind of fire in this city, it's all hands on deck, get this shit out amongst the community members. That's, I don't know, like it's still giving me the same feeling of it sounds terrifying, yet strangely alluring at the same time.
Yes.
To like kind of be in this lifestyle. Like, I don't know. And I know like somebody in the comments will probably say like, you won't know what it's like. And it's like, that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is it seems alluring. I'm not saying I would.
Yeah.
For the very reason of I don't want to experience it.
I mean, desperate times
call for desperate measures.
Yeah. Well, and plenty of people in Hong Kong did. Plenty of people who lived outside the city went into the city to do things, whether it be drugs or food or, to teach.
Just general shopping. Like I said, things were cheaper there. And they produced stuff that couldn't be produced anywhere else. So
you could get heroin for $3 at one point.
Good for them. Good to know, man. I'm glad you did your research.
I did
you just
see
Steven looking longingly like, man, those are good times.
Man, heroin.
It was a happy time.
It was a happy time. Lots of hot dogs, lots of heroin.
The 80s were crazy for Steven.
Wall Street, baby. You know what that's like.
Oh, man.
But no, this is the interesting thing is to continue on is during at a certain point in history, particularly the 90s, Beijing got Hong Kong back from the British. And before then, they wanted to get the city cleared so it didn't make the British Empire look bad. So the British representative that had like the territory with Kowloon in it wanted to get rid of it and basically tear it down before they get handed over Hong Kong to the Chinese, so they wouldn't ridicule the British for letting this happen, essentially. So they did this thing that is actually quite genius, and people were kind of aware, but they went and sealed every exit from Kowloon Walled City and sent all these officials in to basically just get people's information, to find out how many people were living there, like how much money did they make, do they have a business, things like that. And
aggressive census taking,
basically. Yeah, because what happened is they basically then started trying to get people to leave. As a matter of fact, they'd offer them new living situations, offer them financial incentives to leave the city, and it worked. I think they said like within the first year, like 91% of the residents were out and 51% of the businesses were out. And some of them were gaming the system, a little bit, but they were just concerned about getting them out of the city. There were some holdouts that it sounds like, basically like some guy came out with a meat cleaver and started like chopping at cops and stuff like that. I think somebody made a improvised explosive at one point. It didn't kill anybody, but it did injure some people. And the British just kind of let it go because they were more concerned about getting these people out and kind of like, because essentially in most situations where that happens, people open fire, like but killing people in response, even to their grumpy protests and stuff like that, tends to not go the way people think, especially for foreign powers. So they kind of just passed on really punishing anybody for any of those acts or anything like that.
Bit of a fun factoid that I just pulled up. On average, residents received around $380,000 for their individual flats. Negotiations progressed over several years, and by November 1991, only 457 households were still to agree terms. By that time, most of the 33,000 residents have moved out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. There was a middle-aged couple that had barricaded themselves inside their apartment, and inevitably they ended up agreeing to leave. I mean, what were they going to do? And
think about that. That's middle age. That's like any of us.
That's right.
Being like, I ain't leaving.
This is the Barricade Kowloon City podcast. Let's go.
Yeah.
But yeah, they actually managed to talk everybody out of that place, and they started tearing it down with tools. And you have things like scenes from Bloodsport, were filmed there. The Jackie Chan movie was filmed there, and inevitably it came down. And I believe they turned it into a park, as I recall. And like some of the
Kowloon Walled City Park.
Yes, there's a couple pieces of the structure left over as kind of like historical monuments. But it appears that even though everybody agreed to leave and it was torn down and all that, there are plenty of people who grew up in Kowloon Walled Cities, was educated in Kowloon Walled City, it had a whole life. And they all seem to look back on it pretty damn fondly, even with the triads and the drugs and everything else. And that's kind of wild. Some people actually sound sad that it's gone. Like they're like, I kind of miss it. I'm doing okay, but I kind of missed what we had there. And that's the thing, is it was a one of a kind of experience, and probably the most successful, the longest lived. I mean, it was decades that Kowloon Walled City existed.
And call me an ignorant American for this too. Like the whole concept of that camaraderie that they had, that is very much a cultural thing that I think that maybe this place, something like this could exist or does exist in the US, but I don't think that kind of camaraderie and like sense of like community and family would flourish nearly as much here as it would there. Like I don't know. I just don't know. It's call me ignorant.
You know what this kind of made me think of as I was reading more about it. Do you remember after a lot of terrible things happened, a lot of people were protesting in Seattle? They did the autonomous zone, the Capitol Hill autonomous zone, and they kind of like took over a city block and just kind of made it their own, and they kind of just got left alone for a little bit. I was like, I wonder if we would have allowed that to continue and not like kicked them out, if it would have blossomed.
I mean, if it's gonna happen anywhere, it's gonna happen in Portland or Seattle. Like, let's be real. Like, because Portland and Seattle consider themselves their own planet, and by all means, all in the good, by the way, because I love going to Portland and I love Seattle. So
there are plenty of examples of this existing in America throughout history, just on a much smaller scale and not nearly as frequent. I think that just happens to be the result of living in a country so large that we can expand horizontally instead of vertically. Let's be real. You look at places like Japan and even like China. Some of their actual like densely populated areas are because those resources are right there. There's not habitable places all over the country. Like, this country is very fertile and very susceptible to being, populated in a more expansive way. But these other countries, especially say something like Japan, like I said, they have an island. They go up. Everything's pretty dense. It's more of a city kind of experience. Or that's more common, I guess, and more common for communal living as well. You see this in other countries as well, like Venezuela. And I think it's just the circumstances we live in here. But there are great examples of this. In Austin, I stayed in a commune for a little while. It was literally an old motel that had been turned into these apartments for like artists, and they grew vegetables and had animals, and and threw big parties on their property to fund getting supplies. So, you know, a bunch of dudes want to throw a big party without getting in trouble. They could rent the space and they would manage all the trash and things like that. It's this really cool concept. It's challenging to live in because you live with other people in these smaller spaces. You don't get to have a lot of things. Like, you can't have a room like this set up. You don't live like that. It was a weird time in my life. I will say that. But
do you look back on it fondly?
Absolutely. It was a great experience, great memories.
Yeah.
It was a lot of work, and you know, it's a different way of life. And there's plenty of people that live that way, but there are also examples. There was a bakery, I want to say it was near it's off on the East Coast, that went out of business. It was like a big bakery factory. Like, they made loaves of bread and stuff like that. And no one really did anything with the property, and it got turned into kind of like an artist space. So like, artists would sneak in there and paint murals and add on to other people's artworks or squat for a while. And you have this situation where it became this kind of like impromptu art museum. So people would actually sneak into the establishment to see the art that had been put up. That's cool. Yeah, there's some really great stories like this that are all over the country, not just even in some of the examples of like Portland and Seattle. They are very proud of themselves. I think this is a style of living that is more predominant in other cultures, and we just don't see it much. And but the benefit is, you know, the world is opening up to experiencing different types of cultures as time goes on. So things like Kowloon come up. You know, like we talked about, it's not just in pop culture. It's it's not just in like China and these other things, or like the stories. It's in pop culture. Like, for instance, Batman. Christopher Nolan used Kowloon Walled City as the basis for the Narrows in Batman Begins.
Oh
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, that whole setup, the whole like densely populated, kind of dirty, you know, constructed on their own without any kind of help kind of spaces. That's what he used as the basis for that. You guys talked about Stray, which uses basically models itself after Kowloon big time.
100%.
I played the game too.
100% does. While we were talking about it, actually, we had it pulled up, and it was the developers said it was 100% modeled after Kowloon.
Oh yeah. You know, they use the pictures of Kowloon in the game's Fear Effect and Fear Effect 2 to give it a kind of look and feel. The Walled City was a map in Call of Duty Black Ops. You know, the pen and paper RPG Shadowrun actually uses it in its settings. There's plenty of movies that have used this. We talked about, you know, the ones already, but there's plenty of anime that uses Kowloon for settings and just kind of a basis of a look.
You just had to bring anime into it.
Absolutely had to bring anime into it. Okay.
Dude.
Yeah. Well, I used to run an anime and manga podcast. What can I say?
I know.
There's literally a manga series called Kowloon Generic Romance, and it's set in Kowloon Walled City.
Kowloon Generic Romance. What a title.
Yeah. It's actually really good.
It's awesome.
One thing that I kind of wanted to touch base on before we kind of start wrapping it up is there are other you guys mentioned that there are other places similar to this that it still exists, right?
Not. I don't think we'll ever see. Well, I take that back. As you say, I don't think we'll ever see anything on this scale again. But I mean, as population increases and and the world's not getting any bigger, we very well might. But nowhere else currently even comes close to the scale of this. But I mean, there are definitely places in the world to this day. I mean, even in Hong Kong proper still, that, I mean, it's very dense and built up. I mean, where people are shoulder to shoulder all the time. I mean, but this was just that times a million, right? This was a spectacle.
So this is both fortunately and unfortunately, it existed in a very unique bubble of basic ignorance and not wanting to really handle a situation. Kowloon ended up in limbo between Britain and China. There are examples of this that have existed for shorter periods of time. And my preferred example is I have it here. It is called the Tower of David, casually, but it is actually the Centro Financiero Confianzas in Venezuela. I butchered that accent, so please forgive me. but it was this giant skyscraper, the third highest skyscraper in the country after the Twin Towers of Park Central Complex. And it started being built in 1990 and was halted in 1994 because of a banking crisis. And what happened is you have this partially built skyscraper, mostly built skyscraper for that matter.
I've heard of this place, yeah.
And people start moving into this place and setting up facilities, very much like Kowloon Walled City. The downside of this kind of thing that, well, I guess is these people are less fortunate and they made the best of a situation that was available to them, so it's good. But it was handled a lot faster, much in the same way Kowloon was emptied out by offering people money and a new place to live. A lot quicker because it wasn't in limbo. The government was like, hey, there's thousands of people living in that thing. Oh, and a big giant earthquake just hit it. So maybe we should convince them to leave. Because it had back-to-back earthquakes in like 2 days, and it really started to kind of come apart. And so they tried to get everybody out, which is great on the part of the government at the time. So that's at least good. But that's one of the examples of it. There's other abandoned facilities in other countries that have had this sort of thing happen, because if you leave something unattended, it's one of the reasons why it's, empty buildings in the US is always kind of weird to me. They're trying to rent these places out, but they're empty. But you put people in desperate situations, they're going to break those windows and move into your building.
And it's everywhere.
People are resourceful.
Yeah. Adaptable and resourceful.
The Kowloon Walled City is a perfect example of human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the ability to come together for a better life, even a slightly better life, in general.
Yeah, I obviously, if you want to know more about Kowloon Walled City, there's 1,000,001 resources out there to go look at. But one of the main sources for not only where I got my research, but a lot of the YouTube videos out there and articles you'll read pull a lot from a book called City of Darkness. Mm-hmm. It was published in 1993, and it really goes into the history and the culture and the lifestyle inside the city, all the way from the beginning to up to the 90s when it was finally destroyed. But there's a quote in that book that I really love, and it's, what fascinates about the walled city is that for all its horrible shortcomings, its builders and residents succeeded in creating what modern architects with all their resources of money and expertise have failed to. The city is organic megastructure, not set rigidly for a lifetime, but continually responsive to the changing requirements of its user, fulfilling every need from water supply to religion, yet providing also the warmth and intimacy of a single huge household.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Colossal household.
Yeah, that book is really fascinating, by the way. I read it a long time ago, and it's probably one of the things that's made me even more fascinated with Kowloon. And look, as you get more people who were young during that era coming into older adulthood and being creative and writing and just sharing their experiences, Kowloon is going to be in the collective consciousness for decades to come. Between media and people and history, it's going to be around and known for a long time. And maybe just maybe it'll inspire some people to do something different
and more efficient and hopefully safer,
but
like
damned.
I consistently say on the show that I always want the world to be a bit more interesting, and this is a part of history I didn't know about that has definitely made the world a lot more interesting to me. So that's awesome. Good topic.
I had a great time talking about Kowloon Walled City, and there's definitely more to see in the future. I mean, Stray came out earlier this year.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's 2022, baby. We're still building stuff like Kowloon Walled City in our imaginations and things like that. So I had a lot of fun talking about this. I'm glad you guys wanted to talk about it. I was afraid I was going to have to you turn into Bigfoot or something. So, but hey, this is way cooler, and it was a lot of fun to learn about, wasn't it? I think that's one of my favorite things about it.
Yeah.
And we got another episode in the pipeline. Frank
Absolutely.
Dukes.
I can't wait to talk about this guy because I think I spent a little bit longer reading the insanity of this gentleman than I did researching, because I've researched it before. So thank you for leading me down that rabbit hole, Wikipedia. I don't know how I missed this in all the years that I've actually looked into this.
I know what my weekend is after Extra Life, so there we go.
Well, gentlemen, I hope you had a great time. I'm looking forward to more mysterious and interesting things to talk about on Chaotic Underground. And of course, please listen to us in any way you can. Leave a comment, make some comments. Tell me if I got some information wrong, because look, I ain't perfect. So I'm willing to have somebody point out that it was a different year than what I said, because I did my best with my fact checking. But in the meantime, I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend and you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time.
Later.
Peace.
Peace.